this chapter is important because it shows us something that a lot of people don't really like talking about, or maybe you talk about it, but it's something that you struggle with. And it's what happens when people genuinely believe in God, but you're tired of waiting. And so, you're tired of waiting and you start trying to help God fulfill his promise that he made to you. So, it's a very real chapter. Because if you were here yesterday or you caught up with yesterday's chapter, you will remember what happened is that Abram had one of the most powerful moments in his entire life with God. God spoke to him directly. He reassured him when he was afraid. He took him outside to have this visual sermon and told him to look at the stars and told him about his descendants. And so Abram, he believed the Lord. And scripture then says that God counted it to him as righteousness. So God confirms the covenant in just an incredible moment where God passed through the pieces of the covenant. So it was a very huge spiritual moment. But now this chapter just kind of shows us what it's like to be human, and how what Abram goes through is just the epitome of us as people. Even after a powerful encounter, Abram, he's still human. And so faith, it's never going to be linear. You're never going to not feel like you're going to not struggle again. But sometimes people have those moments where we wrestle with impatience and the waiting continues. And so this is about Abram and Sarai. So again, they're at it again. Connection's choppy a bit today. Okay, Sam, try refreshing your what screen, because we did have this issue yesterday, and then after doing that, everyone seemed to be okay. So if anyone, on your end, if it seems choppy, just try doing that, and then we should be good to go. But let me know if you're still having issues. So now we're in movement 1. This is where Sarai reaches a breaking point in her waiting. This is verses 1 and 2. So the chapter opens up like this. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. So, it's a painful line. She is speaking from pain. She is basically saying to her husband, I still have no child, and it feels like God closed my womb. And so, when you kind of slow down and you feel that for a second, you think about, Sarai has been living with this promise too. It's not just Abram here, it's hers too. She heard about descendants, and she essentially has walked through many years of delay. And so she's watching time pass, she's getting older, and nothing has changed. She's old. I want to say she's in her 80s, maybe close to 90. And so, but in that world, when experiencing barrenness, not being able to have children, that carried shame in that society. And so it was like a social pain, and it's a very deep and personal grief. Hey, Lisa, welcome. And so when she's speaking here, this is years of disappointment talking. Yes. So technically, kind of in her 90s, but not 90 how you'd picture it here, more of like middle age, like Ruben said. So, you know, and then she says, I pray thee go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. So in that culture, that kind of arrangement would have been seen as legally understandable. So a servant could function as a surrogate, and the child would just be counted under the mistress household. So culturally, Sarai is not inventing something that is bizarre, but biblically, that doesn't make it right. Okay. And so that's one of the big lessons here in this chapter is just because something is normal in culture doesn't mean that it is aligned with God. And so Sarai is basically trying to solve a spiritual promise that God gave her through like her own system. Hey, Estella, welcome. And so this is why, this is kind of the why behind the whole thing. She is tired of waiting. And so, instead of continuing to trust God, who promised all these things, she's trying to find that solution just kind of feels more manageable and more immediate for her. And so, you think about, sometimes we do the same thing, right? God will give us a promise. The process might be too painful. And so we kind of start thinking, well, maybe I need to kind of make this happen myself or force the outcome or take control because waiting now is too vulnerable. And so then the verse ends with this, and Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. So that line should kind of make you stop because Abram, he should have known better, right? He technically is responsible here too. It's not like a passive in innocence. He should have been the one that said, hey, no, we are going to fulfill God's promise by stepping outside of God's will. And so right from the beginning, it's this chapter is about Sarai's pain, but also Abram's failure to lead in faith, exactly similar to the garden. And it just kind of makes you think about when you are in a very long waiting season and a wrong solution. Um, when you're in that wrong, like long season, it just kind of makes that wrong solution look reasonable. That is how temptation works. It does not always look evil at first. Sometimes it's very like small, practical type of things. And so in movement two, this is, human effort can produce results, but it's not the same as God's will. This is verses 3 and 4. So the chapter then says, and Sarai's, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, hey Danette, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. So it says the 10 years, meaning it's been 10 years since Abram and Sarai arrived in the land of Canaan after God first called Abram back in Genesis 12. So the timeline looks like this. Genesis 12, God calls Abram to leave his homeland, go to Canaan, and then he promises Abram there will be a great nation and he'll have many descendants, right? Then they move to Canaan, they live there, they're waiting for the promise. 10 years now has passed. They still don't have a child. Last chapter, God reaffirms the promise, of his descendants. But, after those years of waiting, Sarai just kind of, makes her own plan. And so in verse 3, when it says, they had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, basically, they've been waiting for a long time. And so that's obviously enough time for doubt to creep up. That's very normal. I think about it. Like if you received a message from God and he told you that something specific was going to happen, imagine having to wait 10 years for it. Like that's, I'm celebrating my anniversary this Saturday and I think about where we were 10 years ago. It's a long time. And so then the verse says, and he went in unto Hagar and she conceived. So this is where, kind of the story gets interesting. Their plan works, right? At least outwardly it does. But one of like the most dangerous lies people believe is that if something produces a result, then it must have been God. But this is kind of showing you the opposite because you can make an effort to do something as people and it obviously will produce a result. The flesh can produce something, but it doesn't mean that, it's produce the promised thing in the promised way. So that is just one of like the deepest lessons of the chapter. Not everything that works is God's will. Some people will say, well, look what happened, so maybe this was right after all. But this chapter, it's not doing that. She conceived, yes, child hasn't, it came, all of that, but it just kind of now immediately reveals the problem. And because the very next line it says, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Basically, what that means is when Hagar realized she was pregnant, she began to look down on Sarai and treat her with respect or disrespect. And so the reason why that happens is because in that culture, being able to have children gave women a status and an honor. Okay. And so when you were not able to conceive, that would bring shame. So now suddenly Hagar has what Sarai wanted, for many years. And so in her mind, it probably felt like, oh, I can have children and you can't. So the power dynamic now just suddenly shifts in the house. So as soon as the result appears, their relationship now is breaking down. That's, kind of how fleshly solutions usually work. They seem to solve the problem, but then it just kind of creates three more problems. And so here Hagar's looking down at Sarai, who's already, kind of wounded. She probably feels smaller. It's, now the household is like unstable because what they thought would fix the pain just multiplied it, which is a great life principle. Have patience. So now movement 3, when we step out of God's way, sometimes we create messy situations that not many people know how to handle. That is the title for movement 3. This is verses 5 and 6. Then Sarai says to Abram, "My wrong be upon thee." So she is kind of blaming him here. She's kind of saying, this is on you. This is your fault, is what she's saying here, which kind of sounds, not really fair, obviously, because she was the one who suggested it. But the truth is, both of them are at fault. Sarai suggested it, Abram agreed to it, and now the situation is collapsing. And so then she says, "The Lord judge between me and thee." So now, the house is full of tension. Um, their marriage is, probably experiencing that strain. Hagar is, proud. Sarai is angry. Abram, I imagine him, he's probably more passive here, and they're not really handling it that well. So what happens is Abram then says, "Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee." So kind of a weak response, right? Abram is basically stepping back and he's like, "Hey, just you deal with it now." And he throws Hagar just kind of back into Sarai's control. He doesn't protect Hagar. He doesn't lead the situation. He doesn't resolve the problem. He's just like, "You take care of this." And so then the text says, when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. So that means that Sarai probably treated Hagar very harsh. And it was enough that Hagar now runs away into the wilderness and she's pregnant. And so, it's kind of, there's so many like heartbreaking parts here to the chapter because yes, Hagar may have had pride, but she's also a vulnerable woman who's being used in a situation she didn't create. She is a servant. So she didn't really have a say on whether or not she wanted to be a surrogate. So she didn't design this plan. She just kind of became a part of the plan. Exactly. You can understand both sides. And so now she's carrying the consequences of other people's unbelief too, you know? And so this chapter is, it's kind of, it's just about collateral damage of that, of the failure. And so that's kind of where Hagar is, which brings us to movement 4. This is where God meets Hagar in the wilderness. This is verses 7-9. This is a very important part here because now that the chapter just shifts. "And an angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by a fountain in the way of Shur." So she's basically by a well here. And then it says the angel of the Lord found her. So what's interesting is that Hagar did not find the angel of the Lord. He found her, which I find very beautiful. Because Hagar, she wasn't like praying, for God's presence. She's a runaway servant in the wilderness that's pregnant. emotionally, wrecked, and she's just probably trying to head back towards Egypt, but God is the one who found her. And so this is the first time in the Bible the angel of the Lord appears. And so now um it specifically says the angel of the Lord, okay? But something kind of interesting happens. It says the angel speaks as God himself, not merely as a messenger. So, for example, in verse 10, it says, I will multiply your descendants. And so a normal angel would just say, God will multiply. But here the angel is saying, I will. And so then Hagar responds in verse 13 by saying, you are the God who sees me. So Hagar understands that the one who is speaking to her is not just a messenger. And so a lot of teachers believe that the angel of the Lord is like some theories are a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. So basically, it just kind of means that Jesus appearing before his birth in Bethlehem. So the reason why is because he speaks as God, he receives worship. People are recognizing him as God, but he is distinct from God the Father. So this same figure also appears to Abraham. This is in the spoiler, I guess. It's going to be in chapter 22. It's going to appear to Moses and Gideon, and also Samson's parents. So the scene may actually be Jesus meeting Hagar in the wilderness way before the New Testament. So the first recorded appearance of the angel of the Lord in the Bible, this is important. The angel of the Lord in the Bible does not appear to a king, to a prophet, not even to Abram. Okay. It's to a runaway servant woman in the desert, which kind of, it's very huge. It just kind of says something about the heart of God. He does not appear to like a patriarch or like a spiritual hero. It's not the person that everybody would expect. He appears to Hagar. So again, it just tells you the heart of God, who sees people that most people would just overlook, that other people would just dismiss. And it's a pattern that you'll see that he usually goes after the vulnerable. And so then he says, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence camest thou, and whither wilt thou go? So that question basically means, like, where have you come from and where are you going? So now, obviously, he's not asking in a normal way where he doesn't know the answer. Again, God asks questions in specific ways. He is asking in a way that just kind of makes her face her own reality. He's kind of asking her to really stop and think. She ran out of pain and emotion, but he's kind of forcing her to look at her situation. Like, where did you come from? But where are you actually going? It's a very symbolic depth of the question. Because, when the pain gets really intense, sometimes people will run without even asking or considering those two things. You kind of act on impulse, right? And so she answers honestly and she says, I flee from the face of my mistress, Sarai. So the angel of the Lord then says something which is kind of difficult to understand, maybe at first, because he says, return to thy mistress and submit thyself under her hands. And I kind of thought about this because, obviously this is not God being cruel, right? Like, he's not ignoring her pain. This is the same God who found her. He saw her, he ends up naming her future and he promises her blessing. So he's not abandoning her. He's telling her to go back under his protection, not to just be under Sarai's power. So I think the point here is that Hagar does need comfort, but she kind of, again, different culture than what where we're living in now, but she needs correction. She ran, she fled, she kind of acted out of pain, but also pride. And so um, what God is going to do is he's not going to leave her direction like not changed, right? He needs to kind of soothe her feelings, but he also has to redirect her, which is, kind of like it's love too, maybe more of like a tough love. His mercy, it's not just him finding us in the wilderness. He is telling us now which way to go from there. And I think um again, when this happens, it can kind of feel uncomfortable because if we're reading this from like a 2026 mindset, right, where we're living right now, when we think about personal freedom and modern employment and just modern family structures and the rights that we have, when we hear that, she was a servant who was used in the situation and then told to go back, our immediate reaction just kind of be like, well, why would God send her back to that environment? But we kind of have to remember something here when we are reading ancient texts is that the story that's happening is a completely different cultural world. This is thousands of years ago in the ancient Near East. So servants in the household, this was a part of the social structure of the time. Hagar didn't have the same kind of options that someone today might imagine having, and so running away into the wilderness while you're pregnant and you're a servant with no one to, help you, that is not a normal path to freedom or safety. It was extremely dangerous. Think about it. A pregnant woman alone in the desert, you probably had very little chance of surviving long term. And so God telling her to return is to help her, not ignoring her pain. And so what God then does is we're now in movement 5. He gives her a promise. This is verses 10 through 12. And so then the angel of the Lord says something. He says, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude, meaning your son is going to have many descendants. And over time, his family will grow into a huge people group. That's basically what he's saying. So that's a big promise, right? Like God is showing that even though the situation just kind of came out of impatience and, Sarai not really having that complete trust in God, he's still going to deal with everything in like a merciful way with Hagar and the baby that's in her belly. And so then he says, behold, thou art with child and shalt bear a son and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. So basically he's saying, you're pregnant, you're going to have a baby boy, name him Ishmael because God has heard the pain that you've been going through. The name Ishmael means God hears, which is beautiful. So Hagar, she was probably like not seen in this house, right? She was used in this plan. She was mistreated afterwards. And now God says through the child's name, I heard you. I heard your pain. I heard your affliction, which is, kind of one of the most powerful parts of this chapter. And so then the prophecy, kind of goes harder because, it says, he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. So basically, what that means is Ishmael's life and line is going to be marked by conflict and like independence, and there's going to be tension and struggle. And so I did think about this, because there are a few reasons as to why God would tell her this, because I thought about that. And so there are um, a few key reasons that I want to explain. The first thing, though, that you should know is that him telling her this is not meant to be like some sort of insult or like a curse, right? Because if you think about it, he's like, oh, you're going to have a son or, name him this, but also he's going to be a wild man. And, so it can kind of sound, maybe almost like a curse, right? But the verse says he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man and every man's hand against him. So the Hebrew phrase translated wild man literally means something closer to a wild donkey of a man, which sounds negative, but in that ancient world, wild donkeys were symbols of freedom and independence. And so they lived in the desert and basically couldn't be like easily controlled. So the prophecy is basically saying Ishmael will grow up to be fiercely independent, and he's going to live a life of conflict and struggle, but he will survive and he'll be very strong. And, that's basically what that means. So there's three reasons as to why God would tell her this. The first one is just God is being honest about the future. He is telling the truth about what Ishmael's life will be like. And so Hagar is, kind of, she's about to raise a child in difficult circumstances, right? And so it could be that God was preparing her. Your son is not going to have an easy life. He's going to be strong and independent and, in conflict a lot, but maybe he's giving her realistic expectations. Another theory is that it explains the future of Ishmael's descendants. So the Bible usually includes prophecies that explain how certain people groups will develop later in history. So Ishmael's descendants became many Arab tribes, okay, many of whom historically lived as like nomadic, nomadic, nomadic desert peoples. And so those people, they lived independently. They were very protective of their territory. They were usually in some sort of like tribal um, conflict. And so this is kind of, the verse is just kind of describing the lifestyle and like the social structure that would kind of characterize Ishmael's family line. It's just kind of like how a description of how they will live. And so another theory is that it kind of shows that consequences still exist, right? So another reason is that so Ishmael is blessed, right? And he's protected by God, but he is not the child of the covenant promise. And so his birth just kind of came from human impatience, right? It's not the fulfillment that God, his plans that he had with Sarai. So the prophecy just kind of shows that God will care for Ishmael. God will multiply his descendants, but the situation still has consequences, right? So he's not pretending that the story is going to be simple. Um, and it's interesting because even in the prophecy, God says he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. So that means Ishmael's descendants will survive and they'll remain alongside their relatives, but they're not going to disappear. So um, there is still preservation here. And I think that that's important because, God, he promises blessing. Um, but there's never a promise where it's going to be, simple. The child is going to live, they'll matter, they'll have descendants, but there's still consequences for what happened. I think that's something that sometimes we need to hear today too. God can still kind of move through that broken story and still show mercy when it feels like it's messy, but you still have to kind of go through the consequences. And so now for movement 6, this is where Hagar names God, and it's a very personal moment here. So now we're in verses 13 and 14. And so, this is it says, "And she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me." So in other words, you are the God who sees me. That's what she says. Um, which is, it's important because she had this personal encounter with the living God, and what stands out to her is his attention to her, right? He sees her. And so it's not Abram, it's not Sarai. He is the one who sees her, and it matters because God is the one who sees this hurting woman by a well in the wilderness, And it just, and this is a woman who you wouldn't expect to get his attention, but it just kind of reminds you that nobody is too forgotten for his attention. And so then Hagar says, "Have I also here looked after him that seeth me?" So remember what just happened. Hagar had, she just realized that the person speaking to her is God. And then she's shocked that she had this encounter and she's still alive, because in the ancient world, people believed that if you see God directly, that would cause you to die. We'll later see that in Exodus. And so she's basically kind of reacting with like amazement, And so essentially she's saying, did I just really see the God who sees me and survive? She's probably overwhelmed that she, has encountered this. And so then she gets so then the well gets named. Okay, it's a name, it's called Bir Laharoy. Bir Laharoy, that's my best pronunciation, but that is what they name the well. So which means something like the well of the living one who sees me. Okay. And so again, she's alone in the wilderness and they're meeting her by a spring of water, the angel of the Lord. So that's why there's a well there. Another, interesting thing too is that there are a lot of biblical encounters that happen near wells, which I thought was interesting. And so like in one thing that I learned is that in desert regions, that was probably like the most reliable source of water. And so people would usually travel long distances between wells. And, I just saw that there were, many biblical encounters happened near them. And so after, a Hagar, she has this encounter, the location gets a name so that people just kind of remember what happened there. Then in verse 14, it says, therefore the well was called Bir Laharoy, Bir Laharoy. So the idea is that the spring of water just became known by a name that's remembered Hagar's encounter with God. It's like putting a spiritual marker on a place. So now this, kind of brings us to movement 7. So this is Hagar returning, the baby's born, and now the story just kind of moves forward, but we still have consequences. So this is verses 15 and 16. So then the chapter just kind of closes like this. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. So Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. So she returns, right? That means she obeyed God, which, is important, right? Because her circumstances, they didn't improve in the way that she probably wanted, but she did change and, in a sense, because she did decide to come back. And that's usually how God works. Sometimes people want God to just kind of immediately change every external detail, but usually God is going to change the person inside the situation first before he works on the outer parts. So she goes back and she's carrying a word from God, right? A promise from him, a name from him, and just kind of the knowledge that he sees her. And so now Ishmael's born, and then the chapter ends with the birth, right? But it's not full peace because a child has come, but it's not the promised child. Something was produced, right? But the original word of God, it was not fulfilled, in the way that God had intended. And so now, this is kind of the tension that this chapter leaves us with, is that, again, we can create real outcomes, but if it's not the same thing that God's promise, in where it needs to be fulfilled in his way, we still have that tension. And so the biggest theme, I would say in this chapter is, if you kind of step back, it's just really showing us, something about our hearts, right? Because Abram and Sarai, they genuinely believed God, right? But the waiting it's painful. They started trying to solve the promise their own way. And it just kind of reminds us that we can have those real moments with God and still struggle with not feeling patient and, believing in Him fully. But again, it just kind of shows us that this is a very normal and cultural thing that can happen to us today. I think that what this chapter should invite you to think about in your own life is how quickly a decision that's made in desperation just can like really change your entire household, right? Like they had just that one moment of being impatient, but it ended up changing their entire life, and it multiplied. And so it just kind of reminds us now that our choices rarely just stay contained to just us. And then it also, kind of shows us something about power and, responsibility, right? Because Abram and Sarai, they were the authority of the household, but Hagar, she's essentially the one who ends up having to kind of carry the heaviest burden of the situation. So it just kind of, should make us pause and think about our decisions and like how we impact people who have less control over the outcome. And so, think about it like this. How do you handle seasons when life doesn't unfold the way that you expect? How do you handle decisions when you know that whatever decision you make is going to affect the people around you? And so, are you running from the situation? Are you being overwhelmed about it? Or are you really trying to listen to the voice of God that might be trying to guide you through it? And so I think this would be a good moment to kind of take what we saw here and bring it to God in your own prayer. Maybe some of you tonight, the prayer tonight might be about waiting. You might need to ask God for patience and trust because the timeline in your life is not unfolding the way that you expected. Maybe your prayer tonight needs to be about control because you've been trying to force something that God has asked you to trust Him with. And so I think that if there is a takeaway here, and if this has spoken to you in any way, this chapter might be inviting you to release that back into His hands. Maybe you also feel overlooked. Maybe you were the one who was hurt by somebody else's decisions and you're stuck in situations that you didn't create. And so if that's where you are tonight, let this chapter just remind you that God is going to see you even if you're in your wilderness. Whatever part of the story connects the most with your life right now, that is the place that you need to talk to God honestly about. Because it's just, a very beautiful truth in this chapter. And so, again, where in your life are you tempted to force something because waiting feels too painful? Are you confused, by a visible result with God's approval? Are you carrying pain from somebody else's decision? And so just remember that when people get tired of waiting, sometimes they create pain. But even in the pain that we create, God is still the God who sees. I'm glad that this reached you. That was it. This chapter a little shorter than yesterday. Yesterday we reached an hour, but yeah, I really hope that, if this anything that I said here resonated, I think that that's where you need to take your prayers tonight. So yesterday was a lot heavier. Yeah. Thank you guys again. This is the last Bible study up until Monday. If this is your first time watching, thank you so much for joining. I really do appreciate it. It's so fun doing these and connecting with all of you and getting to know you guys. I feel like I'm, like we're like becoming like a little, family, and we're all in here for the long haul. So we've got 6 more years of this and beyond. Honestly, I don't think I'd probably want to stop at 6 years. Who knows what else I want to do these lives for? So T minus 6 years. All right, everybody. Good night. And I will see you on Monday.